My name is Ali, and I'm not going to waste any time in getting into the discussion today. I'll set a little bit of context for everybody first so that we kind of know what territory we're getting into. To begin with, before we begin the discussion, I think it's important for all of us to go back to about 2 weeks to 3 weeks ago. Many of you would have remembered that there was an attack on the water system in Florida. Now, there was a lot of conversation about what could have led to this attack, but the reality of the matter is that access to a human-machine interface remotely was most likely what realized this attack. To put it even more simply, people within a particular department shared the same password when it came to TeamViewer, TeamViewer being a tool that you use to remote into your machine. Somebody got a hold of that password, a bad actor, and suddenly now they can remote into a machine. And one of the workers at the plant saw it for themselves that a third-party actor was coming in to manipulate certain elements within the human-machine interface. That was stopped, the breach was detected, and situations were put under control to some effect. However, look at the devastation that is possible when you think about smart connectivity. When you think about HMI, human-machine interfaces, look at some of the things that can happen just by dropping your guard with a simple thing like a password. So today what we're going to be doing is diving deeper into these critical infrastructures and seeing how we realize smart communities and smart technologies and connectivity, and realizing the multiple vectors of attack that have now come forward. The team at Parabellix brought up an interesting point, which is before we were very hell-bent on the perimeter, which is don't let anybody get your device. But with autonomous mobility and with autonomous solutions and connected vehicles, we literally are bringing the device to other people. We're leaving devices open because we have to collect data. A very interesting point brought up by Parabellix Security earlier on in the day. There's a reason that critical infrastructure is seen as one of the core areas for cybersecurity concerns in Canada alone. And it's not just about the technicalities, it's about the people and the process as well. So joining me today are individuals who are in need of no introduction. In fact, these are individuals that have brought cybersecurity and autonomous vehicles and connectivity to our attention here in Ontario. I'm not going to waste any more time, and I'm going to introduce them, or rather have them introduce themselves, beginning with Dr. Ikjot Saini. Ikjot, can you introduce yourselves and tell us one thing about this space that excites you? Ikjot?
Thank you so much, Ali, for such a great introduction to the topic. And I'm Ikjot Saini. I'm in University of Windsor. I'm assistant prof in the School of Computer Science. And as part of my research, I work on the V2X privacy and focus also on the security aspects and look for the potential threats and risks in these standards and the developing standards that we are having right now. So what excites me, it's the, I think the connected vehicles touches our life or will be going to touch our lives directly. And I feel very, it seems like it's a very sensitive topic and needs a lot of people to be working together on this. And that's why I'm into this.
Fantastic. And Ikjot, for the crowd, I will let them know, the saying, well done is better than well said. The achievements that Ikjot has behind her are truly remarkable. And I recommend to everybody to take some time to take a look at some of the initiatives that she's a part of. Ikjot, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go over to my colleague over at Ontario Tech, Khalil. Please introduce yourself and tell us, similar to Ikjot, tell us a little bit about what got you thinking about autonomous vehicles, smart infrastructure, and security. Khalil?
Thanks, Ali, and hello, everyone. So my name is Dr. El-Khatib. I am a professor at Ontario Tech University. 10 years ago, we started working on security for vehicular ad hoc network, which right now it changed the title, became Connected and Autonomous Vehicle. The interesting part that got me into this field are basically the security elements that are involved with connected vehicle. I mean, you look at connected vehicles right now, they have so many codes, they have so many electronics in there, and many of them they could be accessed remotely for added features. So it's not hard to start imagining what are the security and the privacy implications. Forensic work work could be done on the vehicle, but mostly like what are the security, what are the things that can go wrong with the vehicle when you open it for remote applications. And that what got me thinking into the domain of connected vehicle, and what are the potentials, especially when you talk about data and vehicle and things that are moving around. So that's what got me into the field.
Fantastic. And for those of you that are watching, our friends at Ontario Tech have a fantastic master's program in cybersecurity, and Dr. El-Khatib, whereas I call him Khalil, will also be speaking with me along with Ikjot at Canadian Women in Cybersecurity next week. So Khalil, always a pleasure to share a stage with you. And I really agree with you that hackers hack systems, but the experts hack people. And you really need to understand the people that are using these technologies. So thank you for that. Danny, my man, my mentor in the space of cybersecurity. We live in a very strange time. Our kids talk back to us, but so too do our machines. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what gets you thinking a lot when you think about smart infrastructure. And you're on mute. Somebody had to do it, and it was Danny.
Well, and you're right, I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Ali, for having me here. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, so I'm a professor at Durham College, at the same time at Trent University. My area of discipline involves basically data privacy compliance, as well as vulnerability management and penetration testing on the cybersecurity field. To Ali's point, I would say, in terms of connected autonomous vehicle, there is a new service model that's coming up, which is a mobility as a service. And this got me thinking that along this model, we can automate much of the issues and risks that are present in the present CAV infrastructure nowadays. This particular model can define the framework, can define the policy, the standards, and the protocol. So, and it's still not yet a saturated field. So yeah, so it's quite exciting to be in the forefront of developing these protocols and frameworks.
Absolutely. It's a growing field, a nascent field, and to be at the forefront of setting up frameworks. For example, we often talk about the NIST, the NIST framework in cybersecurity. We talk about different standards, and it seems as though we are pushing towards a new set of standards and regulations when it comes to smart infrastructure and autonomous vehicles. So let's jump into the discussion. And Ikjot, I'll start off with you, go to Khalil, and then come to Danny. Ikjot, can you help us understand a little bit about when we look at communications between smart infrastructure, let's say a connected vehicle, and an endpoint, let's say a mobile device? What are some of the things we need to be looking at? We've moved beyond radio communications where it's all cellular based. Can you give the audience a little bit of an insight into what do we look for in these communication protocols?
So yeah, so simple in a way that we were having the internet for the mobile devices, and everything was connected through the base stations, or in a way that was somehow centralized or connected through a mesh network. But what we are going to see now is the segment of the Internet of Things, where we are going to have more of the ad hoc networks on the spot forming the network itself. And along with, for example, this is one of the use case, V2V connect communication, which is vehicle-to-vehicle communication. Having the vehicle connect with the neighboring vehicles in a space of 300 meters range, that gives a completely different kind of network, and also give the different set of protocols and technology that we are going to use for this. So that changes what we were doing. It's more like we are piggybacking on what we already had, but actually enhancing it in a way so that we can make new use cases and then leverage the connectivity. But it comes with a new set of threats and changing the entire landscape of the threats and the risks. So now what we are looking at is not just the connectivity. We earlier had base stations. If we are connecting home, like smart home is having one Wi-Fi center. So if there is a problem, we can disconnect that internet at home. But what we're going to do once everything is connected on the road, that is on the smart city aspect, and if there are Internet of Things within the home, making it smart home, how many of the things that we are going to disconnect or will be making sure that it's secure or not? That's changing the entire realm of security, and the increasing threats are increasing way faster than we can actually cope up with and solving right now. So it's because the protocols and the standards are still in development. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Ikjot, I think you've highlighted the point that we often talk about when we talk about the Internet of Things. We need to be looking at it from a lens of the Internet of Threats, because there's multiple communication systems that are running at the same time, which brings me to Khalil. And speaking about this idea of threats, can you help our audience understand a little bit about, now that we have this new models of communication where one device could be speaking to multiple devices at the same time, what kind of positions do we see data in? We have data at rest, we have data in transit. Can you help our audience understand a little bit about what do we mean by data and how it moves through these communication protocols? And now Khalil had to do it, and he's on mute.
Have to do it because we were. I think we were instructed to clearly just be on mute when you are not talking. Anyway, so to add to what Ikjot started saying is that when we start talking about the vehicle-to-vehicle communication and remote access to vehicle, it's true that we start having extra features and it's making life easier, but you start thinking about the security implications in there. So the fact that you can start using data to tell drivers that there is a congestion somewhere, or there is object on the road somewhere, or that the vehicle down the road is braking, so prepare to brake. That creates a new security challenges in there. So it's true, data is becoming very important, but at the same time, the potential for misuse of that data is becoming bigger. So there are new applications, definitely. There are new features, additional features that's making life really nice and easy. But thinking about the threats, that's what kind of scares me sometimes, to start using the data and using those communications protocol between vehicles to have, events similar to 9/11, but by vehicles. You start thinking, yeah, everybody wants extra connectivity, everybody wants extra data, but I think it's up to the research communities to start thinking, okay, so what would happen if you cause 4 accidents, for instance, around the Toronto area, around 401, 427, and the QEW? The implications are huge. You can block the traffic, especially during rush hours. The implications are huge. So even though data is making things interesting and there are lots of benefits for that, the threats are becoming bigger and bigger.
Absolutely. And I want to work with that a little bit, because I think you've really highlighted that it's not just data that's in transit or data that's live, there's data at rest. How do we store these data sets? Where are they being stored? Who has access to some of these endpoints? I want to come back to that conversation as well, but I want to bring Danny back into this. And Danny, you're very humble in your introduction, but you wear multiple hats. Besides being in cybersecurity, you also play in the world of AI. And you and I have often discussed that there's no AI without IA. There's no artificial intelligence without information architecture. Can you talk a little bit about the backbone and the overall last mile technologies that are there that are now enabling this transmission of data? What do we mean when we talk about 5G systems that are enabling these kind of environments and the new communication advancements?
Right. So one thing that we need to understand when we are developing or deploying CAV and the infrastructure in general is that automation play a very important role in this particular infrastructure, and automation should be implemented across the entire security architecture. So for instance, for mobile service providers, right, automation must expand across all layers of the security architecture. First and foremost, the network must leverage as a sensor some sort of a digital cyber attack tripwire, if you will. So in 5G networks, for instance, network elements are distributed at the edge, and they are correspondingly virtualized, right? So the network's endpoints can be used as a detection spots, right, to send messages back to in Australia, they call it the CCP, the centralized control plane, right? So this CCP serves as the brain of the network, if you will. compiling all the inputs from its telemetry, and then deploying the best way to apply remediation and mitigation policies. Now, in the entire ecosystem of this security infrastructure or architecture, if you will, the big data would come in. There's going to be lots and lots of data that will be collected. I believe that part and parcel of that infrastructure, and into a greater extent, the security architecture, should be able to collect and provide telemetry on this big data that will be coming in. So that and those other portion of the infrastructure would remain crucial, both the endpoint and the edge point devices.
Fantastic. And Danny, I thank you for bringing the point of telemetry, because quite simply, because at Durham College, for example, we engage with companies like Darktrace, like ExtraHop, SentinelOne, etc. And we talk a lot about knowing a pattern of life with your data sets and knowing how to detect anomalies and knowing how to automate some of those things that are happening in these environments. Lots of data going out there, lots of backhaul infrastructure to support this. Great, we can achieve things. Once what was impossible today is possible. However, we really now need to delve into some examples of when we're seeing smart mobilities, when we're seeing communication metrics happening in new environments. What are some of the threats that we're beginning to see? So I want to take one example. Khalil, we'll go to you, and then I'll come to Ikjot and back to Danny. Khalil, you would have seen a couple of, and I know you share some affiliations with the Middle East as I do, you would have seen that in Dubai, they've now made it a staple that at Dubai airport, you do not need a passport, for example. Your face serves as the passport. So there's a picture that's taken, that picture ultimately gets parsed somewhere and scanned somewhere, and then results are given. That is a very interesting example. Seems very convenient in the light of the pandemic. What are your thoughts about when you see new innovations like this? What scares you a little bit?
I have to say that UAE were one of the first countries that even they deployed originally iris biometrics at the airport, and that was 10 years ago. Even with the original work, there were a little bit of privacy concerns, and it's the same thing even with the face recognition systems at their border crossing points. So typically, anytime you talk about biometric systems, you talk about the privacy concerns, and from the perspective that it's biometrics is not 100% accurate. So even fingerprints, even iris, there is still a certain degree of false positive. So you can track people with this biometric technology, and this is why there are right now, if you look at the Canadian government is updating their PIPEDA regulations related to privacy so that it can factor in AI technologies. But there is also with any new technologies that there are the privacy concerns that are major things. And I have to say, biometrics is not different. I mean, it's been around, they use for some times, and then everybody, most biometric technologies, it's based on AI. So there are a couple of things that are gonna come, basically the privacy concerns, and part of what's coming out in the updated version of PIPEDA, which is basically the government regulations for privacy, is explainability. So that's something interesting to watch, because people under the Canadian law, they're entitled for an explanation of why a certain AI system, which basically biometrics used AI systems, why they came up to a certain decision. So that's something interesting that's coming up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to our audience, this push, and Danny, you and I have spoken a lot about this as well, that there's AI and then there's XAI, explainable AI. And this is something where, we can certainly delve into that. So to the organizers, if we could ever do a future session on what do we mean by XAI and opaque systems, I think that would certainly be of interest to this community. But working on what you said, Khalil, Ikjot, I want to bring you back into the conversation, because we're seeing very clearly that when it comes to smart connected solutions, smart city infrastructures and connectivity, there's a public sector play, there's a private sector play, and there are partners, the 3P partnerships as well. What is your perspective on strategies when you start to deploy such solutions? They say strategy is the art of knowing what not to do. If you had to tell people who are looking at solutions that are driven by connectivity, driven by transmission of data in these environments, what are some things that you would tell them not to do? What are some things that you would tell them to make sure that they're adequately prepared? Ikjot?
So I just want to set the context, right? So do you mean if we are just talking about Canada or particular country? Because
let's look at Canada for now, and then if you want, I know you have a international portfolio as well. So if you want to reference one international country as well, feel free to.
Yeah, so why I ask you this, because it's important to set the context with respect to regulation, as Khalil mentioned.
Yep.
It depends on where you are. And earlier we didn't see regulations being that, they always played major role, but it's becoming now intensively a big dependency in this ecosystem, that we need regulations, and moving forward we need more and more, and also need the catch up and have that pace where the development of the technology should not be way faster than the regulations. So what Khalil just mentioned is the privacy, and he touched upon one of the aspects that I worked with, and I was always concerned about with the collection of data and passive collection of data, not the active one. So let's say if there is possibility of collection of data, but it's not by some authorized personnel, then what happens to that? And how would you even recognize that somebody is passively listening to the communication and collecting the data and might misuse or use it for any purposes? So that creates a new set of problems, because we earlier have seen that if there is an active attack, then we can actually follow up and have the intervention, and we can check up and have the regulation based on that and can file a complaint, right? But if it's happening now passively, now we don't even know what's happening, who is recording the data and how it's being done. So one of the few things that I would say, like if there are changes, or if there are open calls for changing, there are different RFPs and also for rulemaking, there are always open calls to give the ideas from open, like publicly you can suggest what you think, and as customers you can also say that for commercialization of certain technologies, is it ready for the customer use or not? And when you're building the product, it's very important that you are considering the customer and product, not just the technology itself, because it's the people who are going to get impacted in the end. And when you these and smart vehicles, it's very common to say that security is the safety in these technologies. So please don't underestimate when you are building such technologies. It's going to have direct impact, not just monetary impact, but also it can be their lives are at stake in this technology. So we need to make sure that regulations are hand in hand with the pace at which we are developing the technology within a country. It's very important right now. So in North America, the pace is different than Europe, and then they are different pace than China. So because each country works differently, and geographically, it impacts really well, because we can see that we have the longest border with America. So that is going to impact how the international border crossing would look like. So these are some of the open questions need to be answered, but carefully assessed in the future. And when the people are working on these products and the systems and technologies, they need to pay attention to the bigger picture when they're working on a small piece of this technology.
Absolutely. And I remember hearing a talk some time ago, and I know you've written white papers for them as well with EC Council, and this concept of data migration and data immigration. Very interesting concepts philosophically. Khalil, I see that you have your hand up, so I'll turn it over to you directly. Khalil?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that was alluded to by previous speakers as well, previous sessions, is the important factor of security testing. I think Ikjot and Danny and myself, we work in this domain, and I cannot emphasize more the aspect of integrating security in all aspects of any software feature or product development. when you integrate, when you implement, when you think about security and when you do privacy by design, when you do these things early on, you eliminate so much of the problems later on. So some of the things that we do right now, part of the Automotive Center of Excellence is doing security testing for connected and autonomous vehicle, and even looking at how do we generate test cases for security, specifically for security. And that's very important because, if you integrate security from the beginning, you eliminate many of the problem. And if you think about the user, as Ikjot mentioned as well, is that when you think about the users and you do privacy by design, many of the problems could be eliminated early on.
Absolutely. And I think the proactive security posture, which is a perfect segue to bring Danny back into the conversation. Danny, before I hand it to you, I know we've got about 20 minutes left. To our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'll make sure to weave it into the discussions that we're having. Bunch of questions have already come up in my mind, so I'm sure they've come up in yours. Danny's taking both what Ikjot and Khalil said. You work also in the field quite a bit with different firms, and privacy impact assessment, something that you definitely focus on a great deal today. How has the space of autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles and smart infrastructure reshaped your approach to privacy impact assessments? I know you're a big fan of you never release risk, you always bring down the risk level. How has your approach changed to some of these impact assessments, Danny? And Danny's on mute.
And there you go. just like Khalil said, we're supposed to actually mute ourselves. Right. So I guess the question is, so how does this all impact my approach to data privacy and in the greater context risk? I think without sounding too pessimistic, I would say being realistic, it has become more riskier, for the lack of a better term. It is important that we understand that the digital infrastructure and the data systems have to be in place before we put all of this, CAV infrastructure into motion. And the idea about the V2X, right, the vehicle to everything kind of model. We do expect that the vehicles, the CAVs, are not just going to connect to the large data centers, right? They're going to connect practically to the IoT backbone. So having the right digital infrastructure and the data systems and doing risk triage and embedding that as part of the design is going to be very crucial. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be a bitter pill to swallow, to say the least, but it has to be done because lives are at stake here. Right? This is not just, a new web app that we're developing. We're actually automating things to provide a more, relaxed environment for people, but at the risk of what, right? Another thing that we need to also be looking at is the next generation network management, the incident response capabilities, right? We have to collaborate with industry to trial real-time data exchange and open data platforms. That's the key. Without having the go ahead out of the test for this, we should not, just dive right away. And risk, should I say risk management, should actually form part of the core process in putting this into execution.
Absolutely. And I think, that aspect of it getting more riskier and how you approach privacy impact assessments has become key to all of this. There are some automated solutions to privacy impact assessments as well. And for those of you who want, we've done some work at the Center of Cybersecurity Innovation as well with some automations around privacy impact assessments. But enough of that. Ikjot, I want to come back to you because I actually got a question that came into me from Twitter, and I'll reword it just a little bit from a friend of mine who sent me this. And that's like, the question literally leads is that what kind of lessons can we learn from something like the Sunburst SolarWinds attack, which really was, an explanation of or a case of software patching and some complacency in that process. But if I can reword that question a little bit for you, Ikjot, it's when you look at these kind of attacks which are happening through software patches, for example, what does that tell you about our state of readiness for the new types of threats we could face in the autonomous sector? Ikjot?
If it's scary, then I would say it is scary, but it is evident that what state are we at right now? We are dealing with the IT security risks or threats, and also the OT security threats. So the things that we know already, we are still trying to figure out the ways to actually implement them, really implement them. Because this is one thing to have like compliance versus you are really doing something, right? And implementing it. So these are the things we know. What are the best practices? What are the guidelines? What are the things to follow? And how we can solve them. And still we are seeing that readiness is not there because it's not actually being not implemented on the ground where it's supposed to happen. So actually I would want to allude on the different topic. Would also mention that with this connectivity, we are missing the whole point of supply chain. And that actually is also the part of the SolarWinds that also make you understand that how every little component in the car and also in the infrastructure is contributing in this connectivity. And if you just have that access, and because we always in hackers terms, it's the privileges and the how far you can go and hack and access the data, right? And then misuse it. So if we can do that through a little sensor, which was built somewhere else and was used in one car, now that actually creates a different problem, which we have not yet figured out how to solve that. So does that mean like we have to put some sort of security bubble around each piece of code? Because we're going to write down a lot of pieces of codes for the electric and autonomous vehicles. So that is coming to the point that we are now going to protect and putting each, that bubble wrap. I think that should be the analogy for the piece of codes that we are going to have, but that is the secure way to actually writing the code for the autonomous vehicles in moving forward. That is one of the things. And from SolarWinds, we have seen that it needs to be like followed up from the supply chain, all the different components.
Absolutely. And for our audience, I'm sure you would have heard of SolarWinds. It was kind of like a little bit of a Christmas, pre-Christmas kind of story that populated the news. Take a read about it. And when you start to dissect it, there are a lot of simple to read articles around how the patches actually caused this to happen. Take some time to read on it, and you'll get to understand how this is not as infrequent as some of us may think it to be. Danny, you had your hand up, so I'll turn it over to you to shed some light on what Ikjot had said.
Right. I just would like to add to what Ikjot actually expertly mentioned about the area about data privacy. Right now, if you're looking at NIST 800 and ISO 27001, and to a greater extent ISO 27700, they have not identified or put in place a specific domain for a vehicle to everything kind of standards or frameworks. So it is important, again, I'm just going to reiterate, before we deploy all of this infrastructure, that we need to first develop a framework and clear policies, standards, if you will, and protocols around three things: data sharing, data privacy, and security relating to CAVs. Unless we have all of that already in place, there is going to be another SolarWinds incident. And oh, by the way, I've worked with a client 2 months ago that was using the specific module of SolarWinds in their infrastructure. Just for everyone's FYI, not all of SolarWinds products were actually part of the breach. Only a specific. There are only 3 submodules. But one thing that was not mentioned in the news article out there is that majority of the breach on the patch was caused from an inside. So there's an insider bad actor that actually contribute to that. So if we can come up with a policy, a framework, and a standard that can also address those kind of potentialities, that will provide a better security architecture for the CAV.
Absolutely goes back to proactive postures. And I do agree, a question that has come in about the importance of privacy and compliance for sustainability of our autonomous vehicle environment. And I would agree 100%. One of the easiest things to do is to deceive ourselves that we've got policies in place, so we're good. It really is about how you apply them, how you test them, and how you audit them. Danny, thank you for that. Khalil, I want to come back to you. Khalil, you alluded to privacy by design, Dr. Ann Kavukian, for example, but you also mentioned about security by design. And Ikjot talked a lot about, we need to move away from developing protocols and prototypes that think of security as an afterthought. It's not just DevOps, it's Devsecops. For the sake of our audience, can you explain to us, what do we mean by Devsecops, and what does this mean to a project and, let's say, its budget, for example? Khalil?
So when you are So when you are developing a project, so it goes through a number of phases, from the concept phases to the design phase to the development phase to the testing phase, wherever. So with DevSecOps, it's all about integrating security into all those phases. So basically, you identify the threats and possible scenarios early on that can affect confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your system. And basically, you go over your system and you go over every component of it, and then you analyze what are the possible threats and risks with that item. And you look at what are the implications, and you identify the risks, and you can basically decide whether you can live with this risk or not live with the risks and do something else. So some of the things, this is when it starts coming up. We talk about security. It's very important as well to look at resiliency. I mean, you mentioned SolarWind, and the stories. All companies will list possible hacks. So sometimes people start thinking it's not a matter of it's not a matter of what happened, it's just a matter of when it's going to happen. So systems are kind of even patching, or even if you stay on the top of patching, there are zero-day vulnerabilities that's going to happen. So this is why there is right now a little bit of mindset shift to look at the zero trust models where, and resiliency. So basically you build your systems so that even if there is a breach, your system hopefully can still act in a resilient way.
Absolutely. And I think this aspect of zero trust architecture and how you deploy zero trust architecture, a couple of months ago, I was doing a session with Bill Harmer from Secure Auth, and to my delight, he mentioned something to the effect of, I think, therefore I am. That's something we used to say before. Today we say, I connect, therefore I am. But it's not just that. It's about once you connect, what are you doing when you're on these systems? And Ikjot, I think that's a good area to bring you back into the conversation. Although we didn't discuss this sort of in our prep for the session, I know you can speak to it. And this is this aspect of access management and identities when it comes to connected vehicles, so on and so forth. What's the challenges there like? And can you help our audience understand a little bit when we talk about access management? What are we talking about there? Ikjot?
So is this particularly with the identity?
Yes.
And for the vehicles?
For vehicles, absolutely.
All right. So I can just ensure you that fortunately, we are not going to use the VIN numbers, vehicle identification numbers. So that's not going to be in the plain text on the communication broadcast. But what the research community has come up with is the idea of using temporary identifiers, using the same model that we use for, similar model actually, not same, for public key infrastructure. For these temporary identifiers, and that creates a new life cycle of these temporary identifiers called pseudonyms. And having that in place, it's used for the identification of each vehicle on the road. And when they are communicating, it uses that temporary identifier rather than saying it's Ikjot's vehicle with this number.
Right.
And because that is the direct privacy risk and threat there. So when you say access control and access management, I think it goes back to the vehicle to infrastructure, because that's where we want to have the access. We are not just going to have the direct ad hoc network communication, because then the vehicle moves really fast and it changes the position and location as it's moving. But rather, when the vehicles are connected with the infrastructure, like we are today connected with the base stations when we are in a certain region, even though we are moving, for a long time, we are within the same region. And that there is a connectivity between your mobile device and the base station. That gives the access of the vehicle to the infrastructure unit. Now, I think that should not, that looks scary, but there can be the infrastructure units which may be compromised. If that is the case, then that is one of the potential ways that there is. It seems like the authorized access, but it's not the authorized access. So that is the case which you actually mentioned. And when that's going to happen, it's going to be getting all the information that your vehicle has to give. So that information is, if this is level 3 autonomy we are talking, it means even the controls, because level 3 onwards, we are going to have let the vehicle decides how to move and how to navigate. And so what starts happening at that level? That's why everything we have discussed till this point is important, regulations and all those things, because now if there is access through this infrastructure unit, I'm not even talking the case where the other vehicle can hack. I'm just talking the infrastructure unit, because today we see that and we can understand that better. And if there is a hack or remote access through your vehicle there, then it can actually start making those decisions for you for your navigation. So that is the serious and the most serious risk the worst possible case scenario that we can think of is that in terms of access.
Absolutely. And I couldn't have said it better. Data is the new oil. Data is a new form of currency, and how we transmit that and to whom and who has access to it, etc., all are going to be fundamental in our security and privacy postures. We've got about 2.5 minutes left. And Danny, I'm going to give you the final question, and then we'll close with some concluding remarks. And Danny, when Ikjot was talking about data, how we encrypt the data, how we share this data, so on and so forth, the best data analysts or data scientists are good storytellers. Can you help our audience understand a little bit about some of the social engineering attacks that we're beginning to see because of the state of connectivity we find ourselves in? Danny, a couple of seconds to you, sir.
Well, first of all, the biggest example would be the man-in-the-middle attack whenever data is in transit or in motion, right? So, connected autonomous vehicle is no different. I can already foresee that there's going to be a vehicle in the middle attack whenever the actual CAV is trying to communicate with the data center. Especially Ikjot mentioned about level 3 and above, specifically levels 3 and 4. This is going to be very crucial. And I'm pretty sure, since there's no standard, we don't even have a protocol that says what kind of encryption cipher that we're going to put in place for data in motion on a level 3, level 4 communication. That opens a Pandora's box right then and there. So in terms of social engineering, again, on the context of CAV, the idea of vehicle to everything kind of opens the floodgate for the information on the vehicle to be shared practically by any appliance out there that's connected to the internet. How are we going to secure that? That's another problem. Are we going to use the basic TLS, SSL encryption that is available out there, or should we use a different form of cipher encryption specifically for V2X kind of model? So those are things that have not yet been discussed, and these are things that we really need to wrap our head around as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that there is a huge opportunity for us as a cohort at this conference to put together some policies and to put together some recommendations. So Danny, thank you for that. We have come to the final few minutes of our time, so I am going to request that we all come to a conclusion. But Danny, I really like that line, vehicle in the middle of attacks. I think that's something that we can play with going forward. In concluding remarks, I'm going to go to each one of the panelists and ask you to make one recommendation. So Ikjot, we'll start off with you. If somebody wanted to learn more about the work that you do in autonomous vehicles and security, what's a resource that you would recommend them to?
I work on, I never say that I work on autonomous vehicles. I always make sure that it's very clear that I work on V2X and connected vehicle security. And I follow up with the current standards development, and using I use all the papers from IEEE because that's the closest one. And I'm looking and have my eyes on ISO standards coming forward someday on V2X. So that would be my next thing. But also ISO 21434 standard, because somehow it's going to be overall part of this because it has cybersecurity road vehicles. So now we need to start understanding as an ecosystem what it's going to look like. But for sure, these are some of the resources. Go with the standard resources first, and then understand the architecture, system architecture, and underlying protocols.
Fantastic. As always, very thorough, Ikjot. Khalil, yourself, closing comments and a resource that you would recommend to our audience. And the final, you're on mute statement.
So there is a new standard, as Ikjot mentioned, that's coming out from ISO and ACE, the 21434. One thing that as well I should mention that as a final note, it's very important to implement privacy by design, do security testing, and if anybody needs any help, we just launched at the University Institute of Cybersecurity and Resiliency Systems, and there is the Automotive Center of Excellence that we could help with security testing as well. So there are lots of resources out there. It's up to the community to seek for these resources and use. Yes.
Absolutely. And Danny, same question to you. Final words, Danny, a resource that you'd recommend.
Well, you and I work with the Artificial Intelligence Hub and the Cybersecurity Innovation Hub in Durham College, where we design, applications specifically for this kind of implementation. So please go to Durham College and look for the AI Hub and Cybersecurity Innovation Hub links.
Danny, thank you very much. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. I surely learned a lot. I think one of the things that stayed in my head was that do we necessarily secure our systems or build systems that are secure? And I think we need to build systems that are secure. Security doesn't need to be an afterthought. You have to have a proactive posture to security. I thank you again, Ikjot, Khalil, and Danny, for giving me the time and the honor to interview you for this panel.